Well, we saw that for Aristotle, a virtue, it's not either you have the virtue or you don't. A virtue is always the mean, the middle ground between two vices. One, a vice where you're of deprivation, where you're depriving yourself of something, and the other vice of excess. And so, last time we looked at a couple of Aristotle's examples, like temperance, the people who demonstrated for prohibition in like the early part of the 20th century, one of them was the WCTU, which was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, trying to get laws against the evil curse of drink. Well, at any rate, but temperance is a virtue associated with how we handle, what we put into our body in terms of food and drink. And Plato and Socrates, knew that as physical beings, our bodies have certain needs, and their view was that it was wrong to totally deny the needs of your body, right? So Aristotle basically takes the same view that asceticism, that is, trying to extremely deny your body's needs, is not, for him, the virtuous course of action. But then neither, of course, is gluttony, overeating. So for him, temperance is the middle ground between the two. Likewise, courage is the middle ground between cowardice, a lack of courage, or foolhardiness, having too much. But so as I think I said to your class or the last class, my Greek professor, when I was in college in the 70s, think about it, it was only like 15 years earlier that World War II had ended. It's farther from the first Gulf War now for you all than it was for them to World War II. So my Greek professor had, I guess, led a platoon of men, and he said they had a young guy coming in there, and, they got into a firefight with the Germans, and this guy stands up like they do in the John Wayne movies, shooting, and he got shot, Well, I think Aristotle would look at something like that and say, well, that's not necessarily an example of courage so much as it's maybe an example of foolhardiness. So for Aristotle, it's feeling fear but controlling it, And again, you find, they interview athletes before the Super Bowl, and some of them are honest enough to admit they have some butterflies in their stomach. It usually goes away once you get involved in the game. Or singers and performers, get get butterflies before, but they control their, their fear, and they're able to perform. And this is very much Aristotle's view of things. That courage is a middle ground between fearing everything and fearing nothing. Now, so sometimes we have to work against our natural tendencies, like to be fearful or to overeat or whatever. The Plato and Socrates emphasize reason, and Aristotle is very much in the same tradition. And we saw that the whole point of the story of the allegory in the cave is whether or not there might be a realm, of existence that constitutes true knowledge about it, and whether it's accessible not by our senses but by our reason. That was Plato's view of the forms in that ethereal world, right? Now, Aristotle rejected the independent existence of the forms. Maybe one of the reasons why he wasn't picked to succeed Plato at Plato's school and had to go off and find his own school of philosophy. But Aristotle also believes that reason is extremely important. In other words, both Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle think that if we govern ourselves and the desires of our lower nature by the rational part of ourselves, that's how we can keep things in control. So you can say, well, how do we achieve the mean? Well, by using our reason to override some of our natural tendencies, Now, here we see in Aristotle a point of view that is still discussed today. Are human reasoning abilities different in kind than the reasoning abilities of non-human animals? Or, as the evolutionists would say, are they different only in degree? Many philosophers throughout the history of philosophy, and two very prominent examples of this that we're going to look at, Aristotle being one of them, Aquinas another, but also Immanuel Kant, basically, these philosophers thought that we could draw a very sharp line between ourselves and the rest of the animal kingdom, and so that it was basically our reasoning abilities that put us in a totally different category. Immanuel Kant goes a step beyond that, and he argues that we have obligations morally to human beings that we don't to non-human animals, because human beings are able to understand and act on principle, follow moral rules in a way that my cat could not have done that, that non-human animals aren't. And the way Aristotle does this, he tries to say, well, what is the essential nature of something? And here, he uses the same kind of word that is used also for the essential natures of inanimate things. for Aristotle, many times that's designed with their, or tied to the purpose of something, right? The purpose of a pen is to write. The purpose of a knife, and the word here is technia, is to cut something. In other words, for Aristotle, the essential nature of a knife is that it's an implement for cutting things. Now, we don't, if you and I were fixing a meal in my kitchen and I said, well, hey, I got to cut through a chicken bone here or something, go over there and get me that really virtuous knife. It would say, virtuous knife? What do you mean? A knife can't have moral virtue. We don't talk about things that way, but the same word is used for the excellence of an implement in performing its function as is used for the excellence of a person in being a good moral person. So the virtue of a thing is tied up with its performing its function excellently. Now, we don't talk in English about a virtuous knife, but we do use the word good in both a moral and a non-moral sense, right? She's a good girl. He's a good man. Or, that's a good knife. No, don't hand me that knife. Come on, I got to do some real cutting. Give me the other one. That's a really good knife over there. Why? Because it performs its function well. So you say, well, why go off onto this tangent? What's this to do with virtue? Well, for Aristotle, the virtue of a thing is tied up with its performing its essential nature well. And both the intellectual and the moral virtues for Aristotle are tied in with our essential nature as human beings and our performing that function well. Now, I'm not asking you to agree with this, but even today, we talk about whether reasoning abilities make us uniquely human. So, we achieve the mean by reason. We achieve a virtuous life by our rational abilities. And for Aristotle, our reasoning abilities is what's unique to human beings. So he says plants have biological functions, non-human animals have both biological functions and an emotional life. But Aristotle tries to say that only human beings have reason in, the ability to follow an abstract demonstration. The way I used to like to do it is to, and I used to do this on the board, is to sort of put it in a simple diagram. In other words, but plants, non-human animals, and human beings have biological functions. That's what sets us apart from inanimate, non-human things. I mean, non-living things, right? So Aristotle says, well, this can't be our unique human nature because we share that with non-human animals and even with plants. Now, if you talk about having an emotional life, the ability to feel pleasure and pain, unless we're talking science fiction here, the poor plants lose out, right? But Aristotle says, well, look, just having an emotional life can't be what's unique to us as human beings because non-human animals share that also. And most philosophers agreed to that, except Descartes, when we look at him later, had this weird... he tried to argue that we're essentially the ghost in the machine, an immaterial soul and a material body. And for Descartes, having an emotional life is a function of our immaterial soul. And he did not think that ordinary non-human animals had a soul. Now, the theologians debate this even today. Are we going to have our cat in heaven with us? Christian people debate this, conservative evangelical Christians who believe that there's a heaven. Even if you believe you're going to be there, is there a chance your cat's going to be there too? Well, the point is, for Descartes, the answer would have been no, because he thought, we have souls, they don't. But if for Descartes, the soul is the seat of our emotional life, and non-human animals like my cats or your dog don't have a soul, it also means they don't have an emotional life. So they're just little machines. They may look like they're feeling pain, but they don't, because that's a function of the soul. Now, not many philosophers have been on board with Descartes on that. And when I used to teach a separate ethics course, we had a separate reading on hot-button issues like animal rights, and we have essays from contemporary animal rights theorists, and they have an absolute field day with Descartes on that, on his view. But most people, even going back to Aristotle, most philosophers acknowledge that non-human animals feel pleasure and pain. But because we share this with non-human animals, Aristotle says, well, that can't be our unique function. So what is it? Well, only we have the ability to follow, say, a logical proof, to understand our moral obligations in an abstract way. So for Aristotle, we can draw a sharp line between human beings and the rest of creation. In other words, human reason for him is different in kind, not just different in degree from the reasoning of non-human animals. Now, of course, after Darwin, it's been a lot harder to defend this type of a view because, from a Darwinian perspective, human reason is just different in degree, but not different in kind from the reasoning of, say, the higher primates and dolphins and things like that. And your border collie, right? See those people who drive around with bumper stickers, my border collie is smarter than your honor student, because apparently that's supposed to be one of the most intelligent dog breeds. So for him, then, human excellence, which he equates with, being a moral person, is tied in with our exercise of our reasoning abilities. And so how do we follow the mean? What is it that enables us to go against our tendency to be fearful and not act courageously in this situation, or our tendency to overindulge in food, or to be bulimic and not eat what we should eat? Well, for Aristotle, it's the use of our reasoning abilities. And even with generosity, Aristotle says there's a mean. In other words, you can be like Scrooge, stingy with your money, and that's clearly, that's an excess of deprivation of generosity. But Aristotle thinks you can be generous to a fault, and too generous with your money, and put yourself in a hole. So he thinks the virtue of generosity again is a middle ground. So what's the purpose of all this? Well, Aristotle does not seem to have had the confidence that the philosopher is going to an afterlife and will fare better in an afterlife. Socrates obviously thought that. We saw that in the Crito, that was his chief concern. He said, it's worse for me to do something that harms my soul and what's going to happen to me in the afterlife than it would be for me to stay here and allow execution. That was Socrates, So he very much wanted to do the right thing. Is the right thing accepting this offer to escape, or is the right thing to stay there? But Aristotle seems to have been more concerned about things in this world. And it's funny, the early Christians liked Plato because I guess he was very otherworldly. And Augustine in the 400s A.D. Incorporated a lot of Plato into his Christian theology. But they did not care for Aristotle very much, and as a result, a lot of Aristotle's works were lost to history. Oddly enough, they were preserved in the Arab world, and they were rediscovered. We will look at Thomas Aquinas' arguments for God, some of which are a restatement of some of Aristotle's old arguments, because whatever you think of the Crusades, one of the things that the Crusaders did was rediscover the works of Aristotle. So they're bringing all this impressive stuff back to Europe that had been lost for 1,000 years, but preserved in the Arab Islamic community. So, what's the end of morality then if it isn't a better afterlife? For Aristotle, it's very practical. We have a cliche, virtue is its own reward. One of my colleagues used to quote that in connection with Aristotle, because that's very much his view. His view is the virtuous life, the life of moderation, is actually going to be the most satisfying, happy life for you. So happiness for him is the ultimate end to be sought for morality. Now, I'm not going to go into his arguments for this, but basically he thinks it's the one thing that we seek for its own sake, not just because it promotes some other good. And the ultimate good of morality has to be something you seek for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. Yeah, that's okay. We're all sleep deprived. Like I say, it's not horrible if you fall asleep during one of my lectures, but if I fall asleep, you guys got to wake me up, because then we got a problem. If I fall asleep during one of my lectures. All right. So Aristotle argues that because happiness is the one thing that we seek for its own sake and not just because it promotes some other good, it's the ultimate good that we ought to seek. So what we're after by living a virtuous life is the happiest life. And so he says that happiness is ordering our life's activities in accordance with virtue. To do noble and good deeds then is desirable simply for its own sake, and for him the virtuous life is the happiest life. But if virtue is walking the moderate mean between extremes, then for him the happiest life is a life of moderation. And I know, I mean, this is not, what gets sold in a lot of media, right? I mean, the happiest life for some people is, the life where you're going to extremes, where you're pulling out all the stops, even if you die young, Whereas for Aristotle, it's different. And I'll tell you, I'm not so sure I would have agreed with this when I was your age. But, when I look at the people who I come into contact with, who seem to really have it together and who seem to have the happiest, most satisfying lives, it is people who, for the most part, seem to have their lives in a kind of a balance, and they're not going over the top, So that was Aristotle. Well, Plato and Aristotle then had these views about whether we have ultimate principles. And some of their views were taken up and incorporated into the reasoning of later philosophers. Now we're going to skip around in this course on a timeline, right? So now we're kind of looking at the Middle Ages. This argument of Anselm's has had, it's almost like if you're a character in a video game and you have several lives and you get shot, but then you're able to, click on something and get another life and go back to playing. Well, sometimes debates in philosophy are this way. The trying to get rid of a view is like the old, to bring in another, metaphor, like the old whack-a-mole, where you whack one down and it pops up somewhere else. Now, what has that got to do with the ontological argument? Well, the interesting thing about this argument is it was first thought of, as far as we know, in the Middle Ages by St. Anselm of Canterbury, right? And then one of his fellow monks had some criticisms of it, and Aquinas did not use this argument. Aquinas didn't like these totally abstract arguments either. But then later, Descartes redoes the argument in a way that kind of gets around some of Anselm's fellow monks' criticisms of it. And so he gives this argument new life. But then Immanuel Kant comes along in the 19th century, a few hundred years after Descartes, and to a lot of people does the argument in. He gave some criticisms and approached the logical argument much in the way that logic has been approached up to the present day, a more modern slant on which treats existence differently. And so it looked like Immanuel Kant did this argument in, and so it was only of historical interest. But then Notre Dame philosopher, and who's also a really high-powered logician, Alvin Plantinga, in like the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, comes out with a more technical version of it that we're only going to mention, that gets around Immanuel Kant's criticisms, and so it totally reopened the whole debate about whether this argument might work after all. You know, and so you get this sometimes in philosophy that views come and go. You know, the word ontos means existence or being with a capital B, and we call this argument the ontological argument because it goes from an abstract concept of who God is, of the nature of God, the being of God, to a claim that the God who fits that concept necessarily must exist. Now we're going to look at some of the other ones quickly when we look at Aquinas, but some of these other arguments, like the design argument, like the argument from first cause, those arguments depend, in other words, they get off the ground by citing some fact about the world, right? You know, the cosmological argument looks to various causal things in the world, that things move one another, or that as causes they produce one another, that things have a necessary and contingent existence, that is, some of them are caused to come into existence and go out of existence, right? And the last one is these relate to the cosmological argument, that there's a first cause of the cosmos, hence cosmological. These relate to the design argument, in other words, that things seem to be designed to fulfill or that things in nature seem to fulfill a purpose, which raises the question, well, were they specifically designed to fulfill that purpose? But all of those arguments are a posteriori. That's a long word that means after and based on experience. Whereas the ontological argument is an example of an argument that's more like mathematics. It is an a priori argument. You can see the root word for prior. A priori means prior to and independent of experience. In other words, this argument for God claims that we can prove the existence of God from the mere concept of God, that we don't need to look at the world. All we need to look at is a particular concept of who God is. And so it's like a mathematical proof that doesn't depend on anything in the world. So Anselm's ontological argument then is a priori. It's based not on sense observations about the world, like the other arguments you may have heard about, but on the concept of the being of God. So that's where it gets the word ontological. Ontos in Greek means being or existence. In other words, it's based on a concept about who God is in terms of God's being an existing being. What properties does God have? Now, we're going to just basically get into introducing this. This is not covered very well in that video. The other ones are, but I still want to show the video next time. But Anselm uses a concept of God I mean, this may seem a little convoluted. God is a being than which none greater can be thought. But basically, I mean, it incorporates a very common sense notion that if God is around, as God is traditionally conceived, what or who can be greater than God, right? And so it turns on the idea that God is the greatest being we can conceive or think of. Now, Anselm talks about reasoning with what he calls the fool. Now, Anselm is not trying to criticize other people, but he's quoting a biblical verse found in the Psalms in a couple of places. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So basically, what he means is a person who denies that God exists. Okay? So the thought is, from Anselm, that if he can get the denier of God to at least agree on the concept of who God is, then he's basically going to show that if God is the way that they both agree God must be if God exists, then God must exist if God fits that concept. Right? So the thought is, if you can at least get the denier of God to agree that, well, if God does exist, this is who God would be, and then you can go on to show, yes, but if God fits the concept that we both agree God must be, if God is around, then guess what? God has to be around to fit that concept. That's the way the argument goes. So, and it's meant to show God's existence with the certainty, with the undeniability of a mathematical proof. And obviously, it's a controversial argument, you know, that we can somehow prove that God must be there with a certainty that we can prove a mathematical theorem. But we're going to look at that next time. But Friday, we're going to first look at the video from the series, which I think is one of the more interesting ones. I assume we're going to have school. They're talking about maybe something Thursday night, but who knows, you know. All we can do is just take it one day at a time. Okay, if you missed the roll, please sign it on the way out. Thank you for coming on a not-so-nice day to poke your head out of the covers, the warm covers, you know. So take care.